Hey guys, so I just want to start this off quickly by saying that I am vegan, and just because I am vegan doesn't mean that I can't be critical of pro-vegan articles, studies, videos, documentaries, whatever. In fact, I think this is really important no matter what the topic. I can't pretend to support something I don't agree with just because, in this case, the filmmakers have the same philosophy or social goals as I do. It just wouldn't be right. It would be a disservice to myself, to you, to anyone who watches my videos, to the animals. Promoting bad science, particularly when it involves encouraging people to eat a vegan diet that's harder to follow, I don't see how that's good for veganism. With all that said, here is my review of What the Health. So for those who don't know, this is a documentary that came out, I think it's been out for a few months, maybe longer than that, but I think it was just put out on Netflix not too long ago. It's by the same filmmakers, Kip and Keegan. They did Cowspiracy. There are a lot of problems with it. There are a few good things. I liked the brief discussion of genetics and epigenetics. Just because you're genetically predisposed to something, say heart disease, diabetes, whatever, it doesn't mean that you are necessarily going to get it. And there are certain environmental factors that can play a pretty large role. Although not as large as the filmmakers and the interviewees would, I think, like you to believe. I also liked the discussion of government subsidizing dairy. That's a huge issue. I like that as well. So there are a few things, but like I said, there are numerous problems. I won't go through all of them here because the video will be as long as the documentary at that point. That's a little ridiculous. But I will go through some of the major ones. So here we go.
Diabetes is not and never was caused by eating a high carbohydrate diet, and it's not caused by eating sugar. The cause of diabetes is a diet that builds up the amount of fat into the blood. I'm talking about a typical meat-based, animal-based diet. You can look into the muscle cells of the human body and you find that they're building up tiny particles of fat that's causing insulin resistance. What that means is the sugar that is naturally from the foods that you're eating can't get into the cells where it belongs. It builds up in the blood, and that's diabetes.
So Barnard is saying two things here and implying a third. So the first thing he's saying is that there is this buildup of fat in the muscle and that this is what causes type 2 diabetes. The second thing he says is that this fat is coming from animal products. And then the third, he's implying that a high carbohydrate diet is preferable. While it's true that a buildup of fat in the muscle has been associated with insulin resistance, where is the evidence that this is caused by an animal-based diet? Studies like Barnard's own studies on diabetes and low-fat vegan diets do seem to support these claims, since the people eating the low-fat vegan diets did see greater improvements than the people following the typical ADA diet. This is not surprising, since the vegans tended to lose more weight, and weight loss virtually always leads to improvements in glycemic control. There's also this 20-year perspective study of over 82,000 women that found that the women who were eating a low-carb diet high in animal fats and animal proteins, that they did not have any sort of reduction in diabetes risks. Although that's certainly a far cry from animal products cause diabetes. Most importantly, numerous studies have found that low-carb, high-fat, non-vegan diets can be quite effective at improving insulin sensitivity. Of course, such a diet does tend to raise LDL levels. This is not surprising given the saturated fat content in such a diet, but there is a way around this. It's called Eco-Atkins, and it's basically the vegan version of an Atkins diet, of a low-carb, high-fat, high-protein diet. This study compared it to a low-fat vegetarian diet and found that while both groups lost about the same amount of weight, the Eco-Atkins group saw greater improvements in blood pressure and blood lipid profiles. And that study I mentioned earlier on women, on over 80,000 women, well, they found that the women who were consuming a low-carb diet predominated by plants, so the fat and protein was coming mostly from plants instead of animal sources. Well, they found that for them, they had a 20% lower risk for diabetes when compared to the women eating a low-fat diet. My point here is that many different diets have proven effective at improving glycemic control, at least in the short term, and that basically any diet that results in weight loss will be effective. This is why organizations like Diabetes UK don't recommend one specific diet. Recent systematic reviews and meta-analyses, including people with type 2 diabetes, report that although low-carb diets may lead to significantly greater weight loss and improvements in HbA1c and lipids over the short term, there's no greater advantage over the longer term when compared to other diets. This reinforces Diabetes UK's call for an individualized approach to diet, taking into consideration people's personal preferences. And so finally, the third statement or implication, Barnard's implication that a low-fat, high-carb vegan diet is optimal. So I've already talked about this pretty extensively in this video debunking McDougall's "The fat you eat is the fat you wear" propaganda. Suffice it to say, all fat is not the same. Certainly trans fats, saturated fats, these are fats that we want to be limiting, but the evidence is clear that we want to replace these fats with polyunsaturated fats, that this is one of the best ways to reduce heart disease risk, cardiovascular disease risk. The idea that these foods, that nuts and seeds, sources of healthy fats and proteins and minerals like zinc and iron, that these foods should be limited to 1 tablespoon a day. This is just not based on good science, and it very likely makes a vegan diet harder to stick with.
This idea that carbs make you fat is utterly ridiculous. Carbs cannot make you fat in and of themselves. We have storage in our muscles and in our liver for carbs called glycogen. So when we eat carbs, we either store it or we burn it. Now, eat fat, that goes straight to your fat. Your body can't turn those carbs into fat unless you're really overdoing the calories.
So what he says here is mostly true, but I fear it's very misleading, the way it's presented. So what he's talking about is called de novo lipogenesis. And essentially it's your body's way of turning carbs into fat. And he's right that in order for this to increase, for your body to turn more carbs into fat, that you have to be in a caloric surplus. So in other words, it is true that it is more efficient. It is easier for your body to turn dietary fat into body fat than it is for your body to turn carbs into body fat. But this doesn't mean that carbohydrates play no role in diabetes. I mean, refined carbs like sugary soda certainly have been associated with an increased risk for diabetes. And it also doesn't mean that carbohydrates can't make you fat. Too many calories is too many calories and you will gain weight. And also this doesn't take into account satiation. For example, if someone feels more satisfied eating a vegan diet that's higher in protein, higher in fat, then they're probably going to eat less on this diet than if they were eating a vegan diet higher in carbs. It's true that many people are overly worried about carbs and that if they eat any sort of carb, they're just going to magically gain weight. It's silly, but I feel that Davis's statements here and really just the whole film, that they go to the other extreme. It's like no distinction is made between whole carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates. That's a huge problem. Now, I'm sure that Barnard, Davis, Greger, pretty much everyone in the film, none of them want people to replace animal products with sugar or with, just white bread or something. I'm sure that's the case. And they might have even said as much in the interviews. I would not be surprised. But unfortunately, that's not what we got. For whatever reason, the filmmakers, Kip and Keegan, decided to give us this just overly simplistic message of carbs are good, animal products and fat are bad. So there's a section in the film where they talk about dairy, and I think they go through pretty much all the animal products, meat and various meats, processed meat, eggs, dairy. So in the dairy section, they talk about milk and the supposed increased risk for breast cancer.
Dairy products increases your risk for various forms of cancer, especially those related to your hormones. So breast cancer, prostate cancer, ovarian cancer.
And it is true that some studies have found a positive correlation between milk consumption and breast cancer risk, but the evidence as a whole does not support this link. So this very recent meta-analysis from 2015 of 22 prospective cohorts, over 1.6 million participants, did not find that dairy consumption increased breast cancer risk. In fact, they found that specifically yogurt and low-fat dairy actually reduced the risk for breast cancer. So they speculate a few different reasons for this. One is just the presence of vitamin D, which makes sense since the milk in the US, the milk here is fortified with D, and the US is where they found a significant association between dairy consumption and lower risk for breast cancer. Also, reduction of saturated fat, which might explain why they found the link with low-fat dairy and not with full-fat dairy. Or, as with any studies like these, it could just be due to other dietary and lifestyle factors that people who drink low-fat milk tend to engage in. Just to be clear, I am not advocating that we all start drinking cow's milk, not at all. Calcium and vitamin D can certainly be obtained other ways from other foods, and alternatives to cow's milk like soy milk and almond milk definitely exist. And of course they have the distinct advantage of like not involving the torture and destruction of sentient beings. Kind of important. And the filmmakers are correct that dairy has been linked to prostate cancer in men, obviously, but this does not mean that every negative claim about dairy is correct. And it doesn't mean that just because there is a study or even several studies that indicate a positive correlation with cancer, diabetes, heart disease, whatever, that these studies are the final word. So now on to a very interesting part of the movie. I think probably one of the most damning parts of the film, at least it looks that way, but it's really not. So I'm talking about the ADA interview, the interview with Dr. Robert Ratner. He was the former chief scientific, medical, and mission officer of the ADA, the American Diabetic Association.
We found actually some studies, that a 74-week study found that low-fat vegan diet versus the ADA plan in type 2
I
diabetes.
think we're done here. I'm not gonna get into an argument about.
Oh no, I was just wondering the studies of if this is true or if it shows that. Or
Any diet works. Any diet works if people follow it.
But if it's a diet that's not the proper diet, like if anyone follows a diet that they eat
I
McDonald's,
can't tell you what a proper diet is. I can tell you what an improper diet is.
who do we talk to about diet?
You can talk to anybody you want
But that's interesting though. Why not recommend a diet?
because the data don't exist to support
But if
it.
we see data that we looked up that supports it with, like, you know, the NIH, in Europe, the European
We're done.
Association of Studies.
Yeah, it looks bad, right? I mean, he gets defensive. He won't continue the interview. It makes it look like he's hiding something. But in reality, if you listen to what he says that any diet works. And again, that's true. Again, as I mentioned earlier, many diets from low-fat vegan to low-carb Atkins-style diets have proven effective in terms of improving glycemic control. The most important thing is maintaining a healthy weight. So any diet that helps people lose weight and keep it off is bound to be effective. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how effective a specific diet is, whether it's low-fat vegan or low-carb Atkins, if the patient cannot stick to the diet. So again, Ratner cuts the interview short, and he seems to suspect that Kip has an agenda, which he does, and that he's like cherry-picking studies, which he is. And yeah, the guy wants no part of that, and I can't really blame him. Again, it makes him look bad, particularly to vegans, you know, people who I think they want the ADA to be hiding something, right? Like secretly the ADA supports a vegan diet, but they won't promote it because, you know, they're funded by Tyson or whatever, which is essentially what the documentary is saying, that these organizations are inherently biased because they are paid for by the meat and dairy industries. I think it's quite a bit more complicated than that. Is it concerning? Yes, it is concerning, but does it necessarily mean that this is why Ratner is saying all diets work and why, you know, these organizations don't promote specifically a vegan diet? No. It's like dismissing a study because it was industry funded. This is something that vegans do a lot. It's actually done in this documentary as well. It very much reminds me of a recent study that I covered. You can check that out here. The Shorter Kids Non-Dairy Milk study. One of the authors was funded, some of his work was funded in the past by the dairy industry, and so as a result, many vegans just dismissed the study as propaganda. But why exactly? I mean, is there evidence that this skewed the data in any way, that the data was somehow skewed? Not to my knowledge. I mean, there is, I think, an interesting question regarding how studies are made, right? I mean, if you are being paid by someone or if you have a certain bias, it may lead you to create a study that is more favorable. So in this case, more favorable towards milk, which, I mean, again, it's an interesting question, particularly regarding this study, the Shorter Kids Milk study. Maybe that's why they created a study where they couldn't even look at protein consumption. That's a really important factor in terms of growth and height, right? So yeah, maybe it's possible that because he had received dairy funding in the past, that maybe that's what led him to create a study that kind of catered to the dairy industry. But again, this is all speculative, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the study is invalid. And, if we're really going to dismiss studies and organizations because of potential bias, then we really need to be consistent. I mean, look at Barnard, Neil Barnard, like I mentioned earlier in this very documentary. I mean, he actually fights for animal welfare. He advocates for plant-based diets. Should we just dismiss his studies on diabetes and vegan diets because he's biased? My point here is that this discussion is a lot more complex than the documentary lets on. I mean, sure, maybe the ADA, the AHA, maybe they are recommending foods or tweaking their guidelines in certain ways to favor the meat and dairy industries because of financial ties. Possibly. Or they may be recommending these foods because they fear that a stricter diet would just be too hard for people to follow. That's possible too. Just pointing out industry ties and letting our minds do the rest. I mean, it makes for a good documentary. It certainly does, but it doesn't actually tell us a whole lot, particularly when we actually look at these organizations' guidelines and see that they're mostly pretty sensible. Early on in the film, specifically, really throughout the whole film, but specifically early on when Kip is talking about processed meat and the World Health Organization and the increased risk for colon cancer specifically, they pretty much imply that the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society, that they really just recommend a totally unhealthy diet. So I just Googled American Diabetes Association processed meat, and this is what I found. I found this page, their heart health page. They specifically say to limit processed meat consumption. And then they actually link to this other page, which is very interesting. It's their guide to choosing protein wisely. I love the first two things that they recommend for healthy protein choices. The first one is legumes, beans and legumes. Holy shit. The second one is meat alternatives and soy. This was just amazing to me. Now you go down to the page and then they have eggs and they have other meats, non-processed meats. And then at the very bottom of the page, they have nuts and seeds. What the hell? But still, the fact that they have beans, legumes, and then, soy, also legume, obviously, and meat alternatives as the first two, that's pretty awesome. Okay, so then I did the same thing with the American Cancer Society. Again, I just Googled American Cancer Society processed meat, 6 steps to help lower your cancer risk. And what do you know? One of the things they talk about diet, and they talk about limiting processed meat. So a big problem here is that Kip and Keegan, they seem to be saying that the ADA, that the AHA, that the American Cancer Society, that they're going out on their own and that they're recommending something different from the World Health Organization, or they're going against the World Health Organization's guidelines. But that's just not true. Many national health recommendations advise people to limit intake of processed meat and red meat, which are linked to increased risks of death from heart disease, diabetes, and other illnesses. I'm not suggesting that these organizations are perfect. perfect or that their guidelines are perfect. A perfect example would be the ADA's insistence on limiting fat intake no matter the source, which leads them to put nuts and seeds at the bottom of the page. It's really stupid. But to suggest that these organizations are promoting diets that are just wholly unhealthy, as Kip and Keegan seem intent on doing, is just wrong. There's no question that rates of obesity, heart disease, diabetes, even cancer would fall if people followed their guidelines, the ADA guidelines, the American Cancer Society guidelines, to eat less processed foods, to exercise moderately and regularly, and to maintain a healthy weight. And it's no secret that you don't have to go vegan. You don't have to eat a vegan diet to accomplish this, although the animals would certainly appreciate it. So now on to Jake Conroy. So this has nothing to do with health. There is a brief clip about an hour into the film with Jake Conroy, who they label formerly imprisoned activist. And, they imply that he went to prison for something noble, fighting against animal agriculture, fighting against ag-gag laws.
The pharmaceutical industry spends more money on lobbying than any other single industry. Just like animal agriculture, they are so powerful, they write their own laws that have had activists in prison to silence them.
Government's in bed with anyone that gives them the most money, which is the pharmaceutical industry, which is the animal ag industries. They are pumping the government full of money and resources, and in return the government's giving them what they want: subsidies, imprisoning activists that go against them. And I think it's quite telling that these industries are working so hard and spending so much money to criminalize people for simply taking a picture, for simply recording.
In reality, he went to prison for conspiracy to harass and internet stalking. So he was part of Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, SHAC. It was a campaign to shut down an animal testing laboratory called Huntington Life Sciences. So their tactics were pretty disgusting, including harassment of employees of the company and their families. The SHAC website said it published names and addresses only so that people could protest within the law, but testimony to the British House of Commons in 2003 included excerpts from a document reported to have come from SHAC, which advised activists on tactics for protest outside targets' homes. These included throwing rape alarms and roof guttering at night, setting off fireworks, and ordering taxis and pizzas. In 2001, HLS managing director in the UK, Brian Cass, was beaten outside his home by 3 masked men, and HLS marketing director Andrew Gay was attacked on his doorstep with a chemical spray to his eyes that left him temporarily blinded. I'm honestly just really baffled that Kip and Keegan thought it was a good idea to put someone like this in their film. I really believe that as vegans, as animal advocates, that we should be distancing ourselves as much as possible from people like this, from people who engage in or condone any sort of violence, any sort of harassment, property damage, terrorism, anything like that. I'm really amazed that they thought this was a good idea. So to wrap things up, yes, a vegan diet can be healthy. I would not eat a vegan diet if I didn't believe that it could be done successfully and healthfully. And this is consensus. But a plant-based diet with minimal amounts of animal products, particularly certain animal products like omega-3 rich fish or low-fat yogurt, in terms of health metrics, this diet does pretty well. Promoting a vegan diet as the only healthy diet, particularly an overly restrictive low-fat vegan diet, and lumping all animal products together and acting as though even a tiny bit of meat is going to significantly increase your risk for heart disease, diabetes, cancer, whatever. It's pure pseudoscience. It would be like shouting about lung cancer to someone who wants to have a cigar after the baby's born, right? Like the tradition of having a cigar when the baby's born. It would be like telling someone, oh, you're gonna get cancer. It's like when the exposure is that limited, it gets pretty unlikely, right? There is a point where the risk is just so small that it's not worth people worrying about. And it sucks. It sucks. If you care, if you're advocating for veganism from an ethical standpoint, it does suck. I mean, it would be great if 1 egg a year doubled your risk for heart disease. I mean, how much easier would that be to convince people to go vegan, right? It would be amazing for animals, but it's not true. And anytime we discredit ourselves. We discredit ourselves anytime we exaggerate claims in order to convert people. You can argue for reduction on health grounds, reducing animal products for health, and that's certainly important too. If people would just reduce animal product consumption, that would be amazing. That would be great for people and, for animals, obviously. But in order to argue specifically for veganism, you need to argue for animal ethics. Or if people don't care about that, there are other arguments you can make, and look at me, I have a video on that right here. So I guess that's it. I was going to talk about the Z-Dog review of it briefly, but this video ended up way longer than I thought it would be. Maybe I'll talk about that in a separate thing. I don't know. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Of course, if you have any comments or questions, leave them down below. If you want to subscribe, of course, that's really awesome. And Patreon, if you want to support the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/unnaturalvegan. And thank you so much to everyone who does support the channel. It is very, very awesome. And yeah, I guess I will have a new video very soon. This is why organizations like Diabetes UK don't recommend. This is why organizations like Diabetes UK